Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The echoes within the walls. When I first moved into apartment 314, the building seemed like just the kind of affordable, anonymous space I needed. It was old but structurally sound, with peeling wallpaper in the hallways and a faint odor of mildew that clung to the stairwell. No one had warned me about it. Not the landlady, not the previous tenants, not the awkward smiles from the neighbors who avoided eye contact. I brushed it off as urban isolationism, nothing unusual in a city so packed with secrets. The first letter arrived a week after I moved in. It was tucked into my mailbox without any envelope, the paper a sickly yellow and brittle to the touch. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "If you are reading this, please, don't let it in." I chuckled at the melodrama, tossing it onto my counter. I figured it was some leftover from the last tenant, an attempt at urban legend or some twisted joke. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of those frantic words. 2 nights later, I heard it. A soft tapping at my window, insistent and strangely rhythmic, like someone desperately asking for entry. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, so logic told me it was a bird, or maybe a loose branch brushing against the glass. I ignored it, forcing myself to focus on the noise of the old radiator rattling to life. Still, the tapping continued, growing more persistent, almost angry. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was nothing. The second letter appeared the next morning. This one was more worn, with faded ink as though it had been rewritten countless times. "It needs to be invited," the message read. "Don't look. Don't listen. Don't answer." My stomach twisted as I read it. This time, I couldn't ignore the tension gnawing at the back of my mind. Was someone playing a prank? I remembered my landlady's warning that the building had seen many faces and not everyone left willingly, but I'd laughed it off as old-timer talk. That night, as the tapping resumed, I could feel my skin crawling with dread. The sound felt too precise, too human. I huddled under my blanket, willing myself to stay still, to ignore it as the letter had instructed. I clutched the crumpled note, the words haunting me with each knock. When silence finally fell, I nearly wept with relief, telling myself I was overreacting, that nothing was truly wrong. But even in my denial, the fear was there, a cold, clawing thing burrowing under my skin. In the morning, I woke to find the 3rd letter shoved beneath my door. This one had darker ink, fresher. The words on the page stopped my breath cold. "It knows your name. Do not call to it." My hands trembled as I held the letter, reading and rereading it in hopes of understanding what it all meant. I wanted to tear it up, to throw it away and rid myself of whatever creeping paranoia was taking root inside my mind. But I couldn't. The warning felt like a lifeline, twisted as it was, to some unseen reality I was only beginning to fear. The tapping had stopped, but my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight, as though the very walls held eyes that followed my every move. Despite the unsettling nature of the letters, curiosity pushed me forward. I visited the landlady the next day, hoping she might know something about my predecessor. Her eyes narrowed at the mention of apartment 314, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Why do you ask?" she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Her fingers drummed a rhythm on her armrest, an anxious habit that sent a shiver down my spine. "I keep getting letters," I explained, omitting the details. "They're strange. It feels like someone's trying to warn me." She sighed, glancing at the clock as if suddenly pressed for time. "Tenants come and go in that unit. It's just. Some places hold on to their memories." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as though the walls might hear her. "But they're just letters, aren't they?" Her eyes searched mine, waiting for something she didn't say out loud. When I nodded, she abruptly stood, ushering me to the door. "Best you don't look too deep," she murmured as she closed it, her words like a brittle finality. That night, I lay in bed, sleep eluding me. I clutched the letters, tracing my fingers over the faded ink, my mind racing. Just as I began to doze off, a new sound joined the quiet of my room, a faint scraping, like nails dragging against the door. I froze, heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was outside was desperate to get in. With a shaky breath, I forced myself out of bed and approached the door. I almost opened it, my fingers hovering just inches from the lock, when I heard a voice, soft and pleading. "Please, help me," it whispered, as if barely able to hold on to itself. I staggered back, horror chilling my veins. I knew that voice, it was my own. But not quite. It sounded distorted, hollow, echoing with a distant, unnatural emptiness. The scratching stopped, leaving only silence behind. I collapsed on the floor, clutching my mouth to stifle the scream rising within me. In the morning, I discovered another letter, pristine this time, waiting on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my name written in perfect, looping letters. "If you open the door, it will wear your skin," the message read, each word sinking like ice into my mind. Every ounce of logic told me to leave, to abandon this apartment and the horrors within. But a strange compulsion kept me rooted, a need to understand what was happening, or perhaps, to see just how far this would go. I spent the next day researching, combing through old newspapers and forums, searching for any mention of my building. There was nothing. It was like this place had slipped between the cracks of time, forgotten by everyone who didn't live within its walls. That night, I double-locked the door, piled furniture against it, and tried to convince myself I was safe. Yet, in the quiet of the early morning, I heard a familiar knock at the window. 3 steady taps. Then silence. Then 3 more. This time, I felt a presence pressing against the glass, a shadow taking form. I didn't dare look. But a chill settled over me as the air grew heavy, oppressive, like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. It felt personal, like whatever was outside was aware of me, intimately so. And then, faintly, I heard it whisper, "Let me in." I kept the curtains drawn after that night, ignoring the urge to peek outside, where the shadow still lingered, patient and unyielding. The letters piled up each morning, new warnings etched in desperate ink. Some of the messages were pleading, like a trapped soul reaching out, while others were cryptic, hinting at horrors that lay just beyond my understanding. It wears their faces. One read, and another. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave. By then, I'd lost all semblance of peace. My life had dwindled to a routine of fear and sleepless nights, counting down until the next knock, the next scratch. One morning, after another sleepless night, I decided I'd had enough. Grabbing the letters, I headed for the landlady's office. I needed answers, real ones. She looked older, wearier, as though she, too, had been sleepless. Her eyes flicked to the letters in my hand, and she let out a slow sigh, her shoulders sinking in resignation. "So, you've seen it," she murmured, a statement rather than a question. "What is it?" My voice wavered. "What's in apartment 314? She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I've owned this building for 40 years, and that unit has been difficult. Every tenant who's ever lived there. They hear things. See things. Some are smart enough to leave before it's too late." She leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "The others. They leave part of themselves behind. Their voices. Their faces. Whatever it is in there, it doesn't let go." A cold dread settled in my stomach, twisting painfully. "So, the letters. They're real?" She nodded, her gaze darkening. "Some of them wrote warnings to themselves, hoping someone else might understand before it was too late. A few even claimed it. Copied them, tried to become them." She shook her head as if dispelling a memory. "That apartment has always wanted something alive. And once it's interested, well..." Her eyes met mine, grim and tired. "It doesn't stop." I left her office in a haze, the weight of her words pressing down on me. My mind was racing, heart pounding with the realization that whatever was haunting my apartment was more insidious than I'd ever imagined. By the time I returned to 314, another letter waited, propped against the doorframe. This time, it was written in bold, almost manic script. "It remembers you." The ink looked wet, smudging under my fingertips, as though it had just been written. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The familiar knocking, this time accompanied by the soft, chilling scrape of nails against the wood. The darkness in the room felt thicker, almost suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. I was on the verge of tears, desperately clutching the sheets, when a whisper drifted through the air. Why won't you look at me? It asked in a voice both foreign and unsettlingly familiar. My own voice, yet wrong, hollow. In a fit of terror, I sprang from the bed and grabbed the letters, desperately reading through them like they held some hidden escape. And then I noticed a new message, faint but visible beneath the layers of ink and desperation: it will take everything you love. Just as I read it, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number: let me in. My hands trembled as I stared at the message, dread curling around my heart like a vice. The letters hadn't stopped, and now this, a message sent directly to my phone, as if to confirm the creature's growing reach. I wanted to leave, to bolt from this cursed apartment, but something about the letters, the warnings, kept me anchored. It felt as though I was standing on the edge of a terrible secret, one I couldn't abandon without risking some part of myself. That night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as though the thing outside had grown frustrated with my resistance. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching my phone and staring at the door, heart pounding. The knocks turned to a pounding, the sound reverberating through the apartment like thunder. And then came the voice again, that hollow, distorted mimicry of my own voice, pleading through the door. Please, let me in. I'm so cold. I just want to be warm again. The voice cracked, barely holding together, as though its very existence was hanging by a thread. A sick realization crept over me as I remembered the letters, their desperate warnings. It didn't just want to scare me. It wanted to become me. That thought sent a fresh wave of fear through my veins, but curiosity clawed its way up too, more potent than my terror. I needed to see what it was, even though I knew it might be the last thing I ever did. I approached the door, inch by inch, until I could see my breath fogging in the suddenly icy air. My hand hovered over the lock, trembling, as the voice behind the door grew more frantic. Please, it whimpered, please. You're the last one left. I can't stand the cold anymore. My pulse roared in my ears as I twisted the lock, slowly pulling the door open, heart pounding as I prepared to face whatever was waiting on the other side. But the hallway was empty. Only the flickering light overhead and the faint scent of mold greeted me. Relief flooded me, quickly replaced by a creeping dread as I turned back into my apartment. And there, standing in the middle of my living room, was me. A twisted, hollow version of myself, skin pale and eyes dark, as if someone had drained the life from my face. Its mouth twisted into a sick grin, mocking, empty. Thank you for inviting me in, it rasped. My own voice echoed back in a mockery of warmth. I stumbled backward, too terrified to scream, as it stepped toward me, every movement a distortion of my own. My double raised a hand, its fingers reaching toward my face, and I could feel a cold seep into my skin, like my very soul was being pulled from my body. In that final, horrifying moment, I understood the last warning: it will take everything you love. Because it wasn't just taking my appearance. It was taking my life, my identity, hollowing me out like all the tenants before. The letters, the warnings. They had been right all along. As my vision faded, I could only watch as it donned my skin, my voice, and stepped out the door, leaving me to the endless dark. The next morning, a new letter appeared in my mailbox, addressed to the future tenant. Don't let it in. Hey. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. Whispers in the Dark. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering against my ribs, but it wasn't a nightmare that had torn me from sleep. No, it was something far worse. I lay there, motionless, trying to convince myself that the words I'd heard were just remnants of a fading dream. But I knew, deep down, they weren't. A cold, almost inhuman voice had whispered in my ear, rasping with a promise: you're next. The words felt like an icicle, sharp and deadly, lodged in the base of my spine. As I lay there, staring into the murky darkness of my room, the shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. My room felt unfamiliar, though nothing had changed. I scanned the edges of the room, my eyes clinging to every detail: the pile of books near the door, the mirror across from my bed, the closet door that I knew I'd left closed but now sat slightly ajar. Each item felt ominous, as though something sinister lay just out of sight, watching, waiting. Unable to shake the chill crawling up my spine, I reached for my phone to check the time. 3:33 a.m. of course, the dreaded witching hour. Just as my finger hovered over the screen, it flickered to life on its own, displaying a message. My stomach dropped as I read it. Don't look in the mirror. The message had no sender. My contacts list was empty. The screen darkened, leaving me in silence, but the warning hung in the air like thick smoke, wrapping its tendrils around my nerves. Hello? My voice barely broke the silence, an unsteady whisper. I hated how scared I sounded. There was no answer, only the faint creak of something shifting in the shadows. I forced myself out of bed, every step feeling heavier than the last. I crept toward the mirror, fighting the urge to look into it, even as curiosity clawed at me, urging me to just peek. But that voice, that cold, empty whisper, replayed in my mind, don't look. My hand trembled as I grabbed the edge of the mirror, forcing it to face the wall. The moment it turned away, the room grew still, almost as if a breath had been held and then slowly exhaled. I backed away, uneasy. Just as I thought I'd managed to stave off whatever had been lurking, a shadow crossed the corner of my eye. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing, just darkness, pressing in close, oppressive. I crawled back into bed, determined to ignore the thudding in my chest, the way my pulse raced. I pulled the covers over my head like a child hiding from the monsters, hoping I could shut it all out. But the darkness around me seemed to thicken, and just as I began to drift, another voice, cold and cruel, whispered again, I told you. You're next. The morning came too quickly, bringing an unnatural quiet that seemed to seep into every corner of my house. I barely slept, my mind cycling through the events of the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The mirror sat on the floor, turned to face the wall, as though it, too, wanted no part in whatever had happened. I stared at it from across the room, and though I couldn't see the glass, I sensed something, or someone, staring back. I forced myself through the motions of the day, pretending everything was normal, but every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. The day dragged on, thick with an air of menace, like the whole world had changed overnight, twisting slightly out of focus. Even in the safety of daylight, my mind played tricks on me. Was it my imagination, or did my reflection in other mirrors seem to linger, staring back a moment too long before moving with me? That evening, I called my friend Milo, one of the few people I trusted with things I couldn't explain. As soon as he answered, I blurted, "You ever feel like something's watching you? Like really watching?" Milo chuckled, though his voice wavered slightly. "Man, you've been watching too many horror movies. But yeah, I get it. There was this one time at my grandma's, her old house was filled with these creepy mirrors." He stopped, clearing his throat. "Why? What happened?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding ridiculous. "I don't know. Last night, I heard something. A voice. It said, you were next." I heard Milo go silent on the other end, his breath catching. And then there was this message, on my phone. It told me not to look in the mirror. Milo's voice was tight, as if he were straining to remain calm. "Get rid of it, man. Mirrors are portals. You're just inviting something bad if you keep it around." His words hit me with a shudder. The last thing I wanted to do was see myself in that mirror again, but throwing it away felt like surrendering to something I didn't understand. Still, Milo was serious, his tone unusually grim. "Look, just come over. We'll talk more." That night, I stuffed the mirror in a thick blanket and tossed it into the garage, as far away from my bedroom as I could. But as I closed the garage door, I caught my reflection in the small, cracked pane of glass on the door. For a split second, my face twisted into something else. My eyes were black pits, my mouth stretching into an impossible smile, as though it knew something I didn't. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. I slammed the door and ran to my room, heart pounding. I crawled under the covers again, the only place that felt remotely safe. But before I could drift off, the temperature dropped, chilling the air until I could see my breath. A scratching noise began, faint at first, but steadily growing louder, coming from the direction of the garage. And then, just outside my door, a familiar, cold voice whispered, "You didn't listen." I sat bolt upright, the whisper still echoing in my ears. My hands shook as I clutched the blankets, the air so cold I could see each breath misting in front of me. Outside my bedroom door, something scratched slowly, rhythmically, like nails raking across the wood. With each stroke, the sound grew closer, vibrating through the floorboards, inching toward me with a malicious patience. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial Milo's number, but the screen flashed no signal. My hands trembled, and I could barely breathe as the scratching stopped, leaving only silence pressing in from all sides. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but the quiet was worse. Then, in the stillness, I heard the creak of my bedroom door. It moved inch by inch, the hinges groaning like a warning as it opened. "Milo?" My voice came out in a choked whisper, barely audible, but the silence devoured it. There was no answer. Instead, a dark, shapeless figure slid through the door, dripping with shadows, a darkness that seemed to consume the light around it. It had no face, but the air around it felt familiar, as though this wasn't the first time it had been in my room. Its form shifted and twisted, yet somehow, I knew it was looking directly at me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The creature moved toward me, silent except for the faint sound of whispering, a constant, chilling stream of words I couldn't make out. As it approached, the whispers grew louder, each word cutting into my mind. "You were warned," it hissed, the voice a guttural growl that crawled under my skin. "You're next." My mouth finally unstuck. "What? What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The thing paused, its form flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. It didn't answer directly, but its gaze, if it even had eyes, seemed to shift, drawn to the mirror in the garage. I could feel its hunger, its need, as if it wanted something only the mirror could offer. In a frantic burst of courage, I scrambled out of bed and stumbled backward, away from the figure. "Stay away from me!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. But the shadowy figure only tilted its head, the whispers coiling around me, dragging me down into a dizzying whirl of fear. I needed to get out, but my body felt weighted, paralyzed by the darkness pressing in. The figure lifted one bony, claw-like hand, pointing toward the door. "It waits for you there," it rasped, the sound reverberating through the room like a death knell. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow shrank, collapsing into itself, vanishing into a sliver of darkness beneath the door, leaving only the icy silence in its wake. I collapsed onto the floor, breathless, my skin slick with cold sweat. But before I could catch my breath, the scratching resumed, more insistent this time, like something clawing its way out. I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it was coming from the garage. Whatever was inside that mirror wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled down the hall, clutching the wall for balance, every instinct screaming at me to run the other way. But I couldn't. Whatever had visited my room wasn't gone. It was waiting, calling to me, its whispers like a dark lullaby echoing from the garage. I pushed the door open, and the chill in the air grew sharper, biting through my clothes as if warning me. The mirror lay propped against the far wall, covered by the blanket. But beneath it, a faint glow pulsed, a soft, sinister light emanating from the glass itself. I took a hesitant step forward, trying to steady my breathing. The glow flickered, and I realized it wasn't just light, it was movement. Shadows swirled in the mirror, forming ghostly shapes that seemed to press against the glass from within, faces twisting in agony. My stomach twisted at the sight of them, yet I couldn't look away. My reflection appeared on the glass, merging with the shapes inside, my face contorted in a silent scream as my hand moved toward the mirror against my will. "Don't." The faint, desperate whisper came from my own reflection. It looked back at me, terrified, as if it were a separate being, trying to break free. "You have to run," it gasped, its eyes wide with panic. But my body was no longer mine to control. My hand touched the glass, and the shadows gripped me, pulling me toward them, cold fingers like steel clamps. I heard a door slam, and suddenly Milo's voice filled the garage. "Don't touch it," he shouted, rushing toward me. He grabbed my shoulders, pulling me back with all his strength. My hand broke contact with the glass, and the mirror's light dimmed, the twisted faces fading into darkness. I gasped, stumbling back, my mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. The garage was silent again, and I looked at Milo, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What? What is this?" I managed to say, breathless, but he shook his head. It's not just a mirror, he whispered, barely able to meet my gaze. It's a door, and something on the other side. It wants you. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't want to scare you. My grandma warned me about it. He shivered, glancing back at the mirror. She said the mirror was cursed, that it shows people their worst fears and traps their souls if they look too long. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, still feeling the cold of that glass on my fingers. We need to destroy it. Now, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Milo nodded, and together, we lifted the mirror, carrying it out to the backyard. We set it down, and he grabbed a sledgehammer from his shed, handing it to me. The weight of it was comforting, grounding me. As I raised the hammer, ready to shatter the mirror, a voice, my own voice, called from within the glass. Don't. I'm trapped. My reflection stared back at me, pleading, its hand pressed against the glass from the inside. If you break it, I'll never get out. I hesitated, a cold terror gripping me. Was it really me, or just another trick? Milo grabbed my arm, his face set in a grim expression. That's not you. Don't listen. It'll say anything to survive. But I couldn't ignore the desperation in those eyes. I looked from my reflection to Milo, feeling trapped between two worlds. What if it's telling the truth? I whispered, doubt creeping in. Before I could decide, the glass began to crack on its own, hairline fractures spreading across the surface, releasing a dark, swirling mist that poured out, wrapping around us. The mist formed a towering shape, the creature from my room, fully freed, its face a hollow void. It leaned in close, whispering, I told you. You were next. And then, everything went black. Hey. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Shadow's Hunger. The first time I noticed it, I was sitting alone in my small, dimly lit apartment. The autumn air was sharp, bringing an early darkness that wrapped the city in a shroud of shadows. I was staring out the window, my gaze lost in the sea of lights, when something peculiar caught my eye. My shadow, stretching out across the wooden floor in front of me, was longer, much longer, than it should have been. The lamp beside me barely cast enough light to explain such a reach. I leaned forward, watching as the shadow twisted, coiling like a serpent, almost alive. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks, or maybe I was just tired from the endless nights of sleeplessness that had become my routine. But as the days crept by, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, my shadow seemed to grow, stretching just a bit farther, as if it had a will of its own. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as paranoia or a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. And I was starting to feel watched. I confided in my friend, Mateo, one night over drinks. We had known each other since college, and he was one of the few people who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. It sounds like stress, he said, taking a slow sip of his beer, his dark eyes narrowing as he watched me. People see strange things when they're not getting enough sleep. Shadows seem to grow and move. Just tricks of the mind. But his reassurance did nothing to ease my anxiety, and he must have seen it, because he added, maybe it's time you took a break, Mira. Some space might help. Despite his words, I felt compelled to prove it to myself. That night, as the city fell silent, I grabbed my phone and set it to record. I left it on my nightstand, pointed toward the spot where my shadow always lay, and forced myself to sleep. Hours later, I woke to a strange feeling, the air heavy and oppressive. A deep sense of dread filled me as I fumbled to check the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There was my shadow, lying still in the beginning. But as the hours passed, it began to stretch, undulating across the floor. Then, inexplicably, it seemed to lift slightly, almost as if it were peeling away from me, reaching into the corners of my room. At one point, it stopped and trembled before recoiling slightly, as though it sensed the camera watching it. I spent the next day in a daze, avoiding Mateo's calls. I couldn't get the image out of my head. It wasn't just the strange movement, it was the realization that my shadow had some kind of intent. I began to feel its weight everywhere, the way it dragged on the sidewalk as if it were tethered to something in the earth. I swore it was thicker, darker than before, absorbing the light rather than casting it. When I looked down, it no longer mimicked my movements exactly. There were moments when it lagged, and others when it seemed to be trying to lead. The following night, as I sat in bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I could hear a faint whisper in the silence. It was like a scraping, a hushed murmur in a language I couldn't understand, threading through the shadows around me. Then, as if drawn by an invisible hand, my shadow began to lengthen, creeping toward the door, spilling into the hallway like ink. I jumped up, heart racing, and when I looked back, the shadow snapped back to my feet, almost reluctantly, as though I had interrupted its journey. But I knew now, in the pit of my stomach, that whatever had attached itself to my shadow was growing bolder, hungrier. After that night, I could no longer pretend it was just my imagination. The shadow's movements became unmistakable, deliberate, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. I'd wake to find it wrapped around the furniture, clinging to the walls, curling into impossible shapes that no shadow cast by a single source of light could mimic. Its behavior grew stranger, more erratic, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just following me, it was seeking something, expanding like it was searching. Out of desperation, I turned to Matteo again. "Look, I'm serious," I whispered, my voice thick with fear as we sat in a cafe, far from any shadows. "It's not just moving. It's doing things. Watching. Waiting." His expression hardened, but I saw a flicker of concern beneath his stoic demeanor. "Mira, you're scaring me," he replied, leaning forward. "Maybe you should see someone. You know, a specialist. This doesn't sound right." Before I could respond, the cafe lights dimmed, flickering in the late afternoon gloom, and I felt it, a familiar coldness trailing up my spine. I didn't dare look down, but I knew my shadow had grown. Matteo's face went pale as his gaze dropped to the floor, and I could tell by his widening eyes that he was seeing it too. My shadow stretched, reaching across the tiled floor, sliding toward his. "What is that?" he muttered, his voice barely a breath. "I told you," I managed, my own voice trembling. It's been following me. It wants something." Just then, his shadow seemed to twitch, shifting as if repelling mine, but mine advanced again, a blackened mass crawling across the floor toward him, hungry and relentless. Without another word, we both bolted from the cafe, stumbling into the street as if pursued. My shadow lurked at my feet, but the unease in Matteo's eyes told me everything. He'd seen it too, felt the cold grip of whatever lurked within it. We didn't speak for the rest of the walk, but when we reached his place, he finally broke the silence. "Mira, you can stay here tonight. You shouldn't be alone with that." Later, as night fell, we both stayed in his living room, a single dim lamp casting light that was too feeble to push back the dark. We tried to distract ourselves, but the silence grew thick. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, Matteo's voice broke the tension. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice filled with dread. I strained to listen, and there it was, a faint rustling, a whispering that sounded like dozens of voices murmuring all at once, but coming from nowhere. The shadows in the room began to shift, moving as though caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. I watched, horrified, as my shadow began to stretch again, slipping across the floor, pushing against the edge of the light as if testing its strength. Matteo moved closer to me, his face contorted with terror. "It's talking, Mira. What does it want?" "I don't know," I choked out, barely able to breathe as the shadows pressed closer. "But it feels ancient. Older than anything I've ever known. It's like it's feeding. On me, on us." Then, without warning, the light flickered out completely, plunging us into total darkness. The whispering intensified, and I felt something cold, something solid graze my arm. I recoiled, feeling the hairs on my neck prickling as though I were being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. Matteo's breathing quickened, and in the darkness, I could feel his hand clutching mine, trembling. "Please. Tell me this is a nightmare," he whispered, his voice fragile, desperate. But I couldn't answer. All I could feel was the weight of the shadow, coiling around me, drawing itself closer, wrapping its cold fingers around my mind. Whatever it was getting stronger, more real. And in the stillness, as the shadows surrounded us, I heard it again, clear and unmistakable, a single, rasping voice cutting through the chaos, soon. The silence after that single word was suffocating. We sat there, clutching each other, trapped in the dark as if the night itself had solidified around us. When the lights finally flickered back on, it felt like hours had passed, though my watch showed only minutes. Mateo's face was ashen, his eyes wide and haunted. He didn't look at me, he just sat, staring at the spot where my shadow had seeped across the floor toward him. I knew then that whatever this entity was, it had claimed more than just me. It had marked Mateo as well. I tried to break the tension. Mateo, I don't know what's happening, but maybe if we figure out where this came from, we can stop it. But I could hear the hollow tone in my voice. I didn't believe it. And neither did he. No, Mira, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. This is beyond us. We're just. He shook his head, unable to finish. I watched his shadow, now sharper and darker than it had been before. It seemed almost alive, twitching and swaying in ways that made my stomach twist. Despite our fear, we both felt an irresistible pull toward the one place that might hold answers, my apartment. When we arrived, it felt like the air itself had thickened. My place looked the same, but there was a sense of wrongness, an oppressive weight that pressed down on us. Shadows lingered in every corner, and the lights flickered as if something unseen breathed alongside us. Mateo hesitated at the door. Are you sure about this? This place feels hungry. I nodded, though my legs felt like they would buckle at any moment. I need to know, Mateo. If there's any chance of breaking this, I need to understand what it is. We began to search, moving from room to room, desperate for any clue. I felt that same icy whisper at the edges of my mind, a presence that seemed to curl around my thoughts, shadowing my every step. As we rummaged through my belongings, my mind flashed back to the old wooden mirror I had bought at an estate sale a few weeks prior. It had been ornate, carved with strange, twisting symbols I couldn't place, but I hadn't given it much thought. Now, though, the memory of it filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. Mateo and I made our way to my bedroom, where the mirror hung on the far wall. As we approached, the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, pooling around the edges of the glass like ink, deepening the mirror's darkness. The closer we got, the more my shadow seemed to pull, drawn toward the surface as if it recognized something there. Mateo stepped back, his face tight with fear. It's wrong, Mira. I can feel it, but I was transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away. As I stood there, staring into the mirror, I saw something impossible. My reflection was still, unmoving. My eyes in the mirror watched me, filled with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. Slowly, the reflection's shadow began to move, detaching from my feet and stretching out toward the surface of the mirror, as if something behind the glass was reaching back. My voice cracked. It's inside the mirror. Mateo, it's coming from inside. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back, his face a mask of terror. We need to get rid of it. Now. We lifted the mirror together, and I felt a tremor of resistance, as though the shadow inside was clinging to me, refusing to let go. With a final push, we threw the mirror to the floor, shattering it into 1,000 shards. The shadows recoiled, curling and writhing around the fragments, but they didn't disappear. Instead, the pieces began to shake, the jagged shards reflecting the same haunting gaze I'd seen in the glass. And then I heard it again, that single rasping voice, echoing through the fragments around us. Not enough. The mirror shards continued to tremble on the floor, each piece reflecting my shadow in ways that felt distorted, unnatural. Mateo and I stepped back, watching as the shards slowly began to gather together, forming a twisting, serpentine path across the floor. The air grew colder, thick with a sense of inevitability, as if we were witnessing something ancient and unspeakable come to life. I grabbed Mateo's arm, whispering, "We need to leave. Right now." But the moment I turned, I felt a sharp, agonizing pull at my feet, like something was anchoring me in place. I looked down and froze. My shadow had fused with the twisted path of glass on the floor, extending from me in long, dark tendrils that pulsed as though they were alive, binding me to the spot. "Mateo!" I cried, Desperation thick in my voice, but he looked at me, horror etched on his face as his own shadow began to slither toward mine. He tried to step back, but his feet were rooted, the darkness crawling up his legs in thick, creeping waves. I can't move. He gasped, his eyes wide with terror. The room darkened further, and in the unnatural silence, a low, guttural growl filled the air, echoing from the shattered fragments. I watched, helpless, as the shadows merged, forming a grotesque, twisted mass that stretched between us. Then, slowly, the mass began to rise, taking shape, arms, a head, eyes that gleamed with an insatiable hunger, like pits of endless night. It was as though it had absorbed every shadow in the room, every ounce of darkness, to create a being that defied the laws of reality. The creature looked at me, its eyes flickering with recognition, and then it spoke, its voice a distorted echo that clawed at my mind. I have waited, watched from the edge of your light, feeding on your fear. And now, you belong to me. I struggled against the pull, trying to free myself, but the more I fought, the tighter the shadows coiled, digging into my skin like icy chains. Mateo's face was pale, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps as he clawed at the shadows wrapping around him. "Mira, don't give in," he shouted, his voice ragged. "Fight it. We have to." But the creature turned to him, a twisted smile spreading across its face. "You, too, have fed me well. Both of you. Shadows that I shall carry forever." With one swift movement, it extended a clawed, inky hand toward him, merging his shadow with mine, binding us together. Panic surged through me as Mateo's shadow twisted and warped, wrapping around mine in a horrifying embrace. I could feel his fear, his pain, bleeding into me as if our minds were merging within this terrible darkness. The creature laughed, a sound that felt like a crack in the universe itself, and the last thing I saw was Mateo's haunted eyes meeting mine, his voice fading into the dark. "Please. Mira, don't let it take us." But it was too late. The shadows closed in, devouring everything. There was no light, no world beyond the void, only the creature's voice echoing in my mind as it dragged us deeper, the last remnants of our souls entwined, lost in the abyss. And as we faded, I realized with chilling clarity, my shadow had always belonged to it, and now, so did I. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.